Clinton administration, where he was heavily involved in budget and trade negotiations. Academically, he has held positions at Boston University, Harvard, and MIT. He has written widely on economic growth, finance, business cycles, and political economy. In line with his extensive work on macroeconomics, growth, and economic history, he will be addressing us on the topic: how much wealthier are we today than our counterparts of a century ago? We welcome you to the festival, sir. Without further ado, I'll pass on the mic to you.
Thank you very much. Um, Let me start with the standard screen share, and let me then begin. First, I suppose I should bring you greetings from your graduate Sanjay Singh, now an assistant professor at UC Davis, who I was conversing with over Twitter this afternoon. He tells me to do as good a job as I can and encourage as many of you as possible to become economists. I was hanging out with my one-time student, Ohio State University professor Trevin Logan. We were outside on the lawn on a beautiful summer's evening in America's Pacific Northwest, and Trevin reminded me of something that the late economic historian Robert Fogel liked to say. The killer app of social science is counting things. Yes, we very much need to have thick descriptions and empathy, and imagination to enter into the minds and worldviews of those we're attempting to understand. Yes, we need to have narratives with protagonists, with beginnings, middles, and ends, with cause and effect. If only because our not very smart East African plains ape brains, they find it hard to think in any other way. But most of all, we need to count, so we can tell which stories and which anecdotes are strange and unrepresentative outliers, and which capture for us common occurrences and major trends. Thus, the overwhelming bulk of this lecture is going to be me attempting to count things. And along the way, I will try to draw out some of the implications of that counting, and in the process, I'm going to try to count things that are difficult to count, and perhaps some things that are uncountable, and perhaps some things that should not be counted, and perhaps some things that are the wrong things to count. I leave that to you to judge. For I see myself here more to suggest and to provoke. I do not see myself here to provide anything that is a final or even more than a preliminary word. How much richer are we today than those who came before us on this earth? By we, I understand first those of us who sit in universities and watch Zoom calls, and second, those with whom we share our respective allegiances to the fictitious but very real communities that are nation-states. And third, by we, I mean the entire human race. All of us who all draw the overwhelming bulk of our heredity from some 4,000 or so lucky East African plains apes 75,000 years ago in the Horn of Africa, people whose descendants have since spread out around the world, intermarrying along the way with other groups of Homo sapiens and groups from other human species that we have run across. Fortunately for my task, other people have not only tried to count, but have been brave and bold enough to put their attempts at counting out there in public. Here we have figures from the wonderful Gapminder project. Gapminder tells us that those of us in the United States today have an average real income of $64,000 of today's international dollar purchasing power value per capita. This international dollar, it's a rather strange attempt at a measure. In it, commodities are valued not at the relative prices in US dollars they have in the United States today, but rather at statisticians' guesses of the average or typical relative price structure in the world as a whole. It then benchmarks those values, so the value attributed to the United States is in fact the value of United States income per capita today using the United States' relative price structure. The hope is that this measure removes artificial inflation of real income gaps across the world, artificial inflation that would be generated by the fact that commodities that poorer countries are relatively efficient and effective at making, they happen to have artificially low prices in the United States because the United States is so rich as to be nearly satiated with them. I do think this procedure is probably the best we have figured out currently how to do, but it is debatable. Now, Gapminder tells us that India today has an average annual real income level of $6,800 international dollars per capita, had a level of $1,200 per capita per year back in 1920, had a value of $1,000 back in 1870, 6 years before the proclamation of Victoria I of Hanover as Kaiser-e-Hind, as Empress of India, and had a level of $1,200, the same as in 1920 back to 1800. 3 years after a young Irish aristocrat from a financially embarrassed family, a guy with no visible skills, save a not-quite-professional scale virtuosity on the violin, a guy Arthur Wellesley arrived in India and turned out to be a military genius as he worked for his older brother Richard, the Governor-General of the East India Company. Gapminder tells us that life expectancy at birth in India was some 25 years in 1800 and is 70 years today. Gapminder tells us that in the United States, average annual real income per capita is now $64,000, that it was $5,500 back in 1870, and $2,000 back in 1800. Gapminder tells us that, on this real international dollar measure, the U.S. is now 9 times as rich as India today, was 5 times as rich back in 1870, and was twice as rich back in 1800. Gapminder also tells us that from 1800 to 1920, there was effectively no growth in average real incomes in India. That from 1920 to 1985, average real incomes in India grew at an average rate of 0.44% per year, a doubling time of 1,600 years or so. And that since 1985, average real income has grown at 4.13% per year, a very heartening doubling time of 16 years. But that's the average. Inequality has been growing rapidly too. Gapminder tells us that since 1800, growth in average real incomes in the United States has been near 1.5% per year, a doubling time of 45 years, consistently since 1800. Now, we can take a wider view. We can step back to look at the world as a whole, looking at world averages, not just at India and American averages. We can step back to look at all human history since deep time, since the moment some 75,000 years ago when the several thousand of our ancestors who were the effective public size of the gene pool, who are all of our primary genetic ancestors, began to expand our population, and then began the radiation that would carry their genes all over the globe, first in the Horn of Africa, then to the rest of Africa, and across the Red Sea to Yemen, and out to the wider world. Parenthetically, this radiation, this is only the first of 4 radiations I find particularly interesting these days. The second is the radiation of the grain-based societies of the agrarian age out of the Fertile Crescent of the Near East, even though agriculture was discovered multiple times. The third is the radiation of the languages spoken 5,000 years ago on the Pontic Caspian steppe by the domesticators of the horse and the inventors of the wagon. A radiation vast enough that languages descended from their Proto-Indo-European tongue are now spoken from Bengal and the Deccan west all the way around the world to Perth and Singapore, a linguistic radiation. And the fourth is what I hope will be a durable and complete, but is now merely an ongoing global radiation of industrial technologies and supporting political and sociological ideas of reduced hierarchy, individual autonomy, and diffused social power. In any event, I have written down here, on the left side of the slide, a table of numbers. Average world real income per capita, estimated human population, total world real income. I have been brave enough to go back 75,000 years, and I have also projected forward. Assuming the world still soon attains zero population growth, and continues to deploy better productive technologies at the proportional rate it has since 1870. No global thermonuclear war, no civilization cracking under the burden of dealing with global warming. Out to 2100 and 2200. So what are these numbers? What are these claims that I have to count? For today at least, we have numbers and estimates that technocratic bureaucracies have counted and calculated, stand behind, and will at least semi-justify. Those are the $11,600 annual average income worldwide and the 6,900 million estimated population as of 2010. Going forward to 2100, we have sensible demographic projections expecting the arrival of zero population growth. And we can project technology and income to get a real projection. A population of 9 billion forecast for 2100 and a world with an average annual real income level of $50,000 per capita. A world average, then as high as today's global north average. May it come to pass. And then we can draw those lines out further for another century and imagine at least a world of 2200 with an average annual real income of $400,000 per capita. I see us as unlikely to reach that world, in which the average person is then 3 times as rich as my family is with me in my peak earning years, but it would be very, very nice to get there. Going backwards from today, however, our counts lose authority and solidity. We have economic historians who have at least estimated what they regard as reasonable growth rates over 1870 to 2010. We can use these growth rates to project levels of world average income for 1870, but this introduces error. Growth rates measured with considerable errors induce, as we compound them back into the past, induce an opposing sign error in the estimate of past level. The $1,300 for average real income in 1870 is quite shaky, but we do have enough censuses to be confident of our 1.3 billion population estimate for the world as of 1870. But back before 1870, we go from estimates to guesses. I have written 750, 500, and 240 million for the world human population in 1770, 1500, and 800. These are demographers' well-informed guesses. I have written 250 and 15 million for the world human population in 150, minus 1,000, and minus 3,000. These are guesses. I have written 5, 2, 0.2, and 0.005 for the human population in 6,000, and then 10, 50, 70, and 75,000 years ago. These can barely even be called guesses. For average income, I've written $1,200 a year, $3.50 a day, as the average human real income level 10,000 years back and before. Back in the hunter-gatherer age before the invention of agriculture. This is poverty, this is deep poverty, but not quite extreme poverty, as the World Bank's current measures say it. It is not that the typical person back then was so hungry most of the time they had a hard time thinking of much else, and not so poor that the leisure time they took, they did so only because there was nothing additional they could do that they had the strength to carry out that would be productive. This $1,200 is a guess, but it is a not uninformed guess. It is an inference based on the relatively healthy gatherer-hunter skeletons that we have found and analyzed. For average world income, I have written $900 a year, $2.50 a day as the average real world income level from 8,000 years ago up until 500 years ago, back in the agrarian age. This is poverty. This is dire poverty. This is close to extreme poverty by the World Bank's current measures. The typical average person at such a living standard is indeed close to being so hungry most of the time they have a hard time thinking of much else. The typical woman is close enough to being too skinny to ovulate regularly. The typical child is sufficiently malnourished to be stunted in their adult height by 3 inches or more. although not the upper class. The upper class back then was as tall as we are, almost, or so the skeletons we have found say. The typical child is, however, sufficiently malnourished to have a compromised immune system, and thus it is a world in which for women the overwhelming, and for men the predominant source of social power is to have living sons, and families strain every nerve to do so. And yet 1/3 or so of families are unable to accomplish this back in the long agrarian age. Their sons all die before they establish families of their own. Thus, while this $900 a year is a guess, it is, I think, a well-informed guess. It is an inference based on the stunted, typical agrarian age skeletons and on the failure of so many families which have enormous material and sociological incentives to raise living sons to survive, to have managed to do so back in the agrarian age. And the $1,100 number for average world income per capita in 1770, that's an interpolation, backed by the fact that population growth materially accelerated worldwide across the 1500 watershed boundary crossing between agrarian and imperial commercial age societies. That, to me at least, strongly suggests a diminishing of the punishment inflicted by material necessity on a humanity beginning to crawl out from beneath the harrow of Malthus. Bureaucratic counts, well-founded estimates and projections, informed guesses, barely even guesses. This table has problems. But there is, I think, a bigger problem. Is this table even measuring the right thing? When we speak of human wealth, what we are speaking of is of its usefulness to us. We are thinking of its impact on our utility. To momentarily drop into the inadequate and false Benthamite philosophical psychology, the false philosophical psychology that underpins and has always underpinned the discipline of economics. We hold firmly to this inadequate and false philosophical psychology. In fact, we run with it, in spite of our knowledge of its inadequacies and falseness. And, these estimates, guesses, barely even guesses, they do not fit with it. These numbers are all estimates of the costs in terms of resources of producing commodities, and the efficiency with which those resources are used to produce. There is, however, a huge wedge between use value and cost value, between use value to the human and exchange value in a market in which competition drives prices down to costs of production. We call that wedge user surplus. Simon Kuznets, back in the 1930s, laid down the principle that we would not try to estimate that. Why not? Because Simon needed a number for the aggregate size of the economy that he could calculate in his office in time for it to be of use to somebody. We still follow him, even though we could do better and ought, to know better. But the gap between market exchange value and typical human use value is enormous and often changing. And to look at the first, which this table does when we want the second, is extremely hazardous. Here is a very sharp example. There was a guy named Nathan Mayer Rothschild. He was the richest private citizen in the world. He was the richest private citizen the world had ever seen in the first half of the 1800s. He was dead in his 50s of an infected abscess in his butt. The use value to Nathan Mayer Rothschild of a single course of the antibiotics our biochemists and doctors have given us since the 1940s, that use value would have been very large to him, nearly the entirety of his wealth. He would have been willing to sacrifice it in order to see his grandchildren grow. Does that mean that every single one of us who has access to antibiotics has a use value of the commodities we consume or can consume that makes us far richer than Nathan Mayer Rothschild was? In a profound sense, yes. But then also, perhaps not. Nathan Mayer Rothschild's wealth had other purposes than merely allowing him to survive disease. His wealth gave him the social power to command the attention and obedience of hundreds of thousands, should he wish to do so. For many rich people, or super rich people, that power to command attention and obedience is the principal source of satisfaction. Quote, "It's no longer about what you can buy, it's about prestige, about receiving deference, about seeing 'em jump," as Paul Krugman once put it. And that social power to command the attention and obedience of others, that is by definition necessity zero-sum. If you think that an important element of wealth is power to command, well, collectively, then we cannot grow wealthier. If you think that it is the power to manipulate nature and cooperatively organize ourselves that is more important, then each of us today is richer and more powerful than even the gods of the past. The Scandinavian god Odin, played by the actor Anthony Hopkins in the Marvel comic book movies. One of his major powers was his ability to see and hear things far distant. He obtained this power by consulting soothsayers and by having 2 tame ravens who could talk. They would fly around the world, or at least around parts of Scandinavia, watching and listening, and they would return to whisper in his ear. But all of us today vastly outpower the god Odin in this dimension, which was one of his chief aspects. Which is important depends on who you are, on what you want to do, on what you think is best in life. And indeed, at this point, I'm reminded of a story from the secret history of the Mongols, about how once the Mongol conqueror Genghis Khan asked Borchi Noyan, one of the chief of his lieutenants, "What is the greatest joy and pleasure for a man?" And Borchi said, "It is to go to the hunt on a spring day, mounted on a beautiful horse, holding on your fist a hawk, and see it cut down its prey." "No," said Genghis Khan. "The greatest enjoyment of a man is to overcome his enemies, drive before him, snatch what they have, to see the people who they are dear with their faces bathed in tears, to ride their horses and listen to the lamentations of their women." 2 different very views about what wealth is and what is for. And these all bleed into each other. Say a book has come down to us, written by the Greek philosopher Aristotle around minus 350. His Politics. The first scroll of the Politics is about economics, is about the acquisition, preservation, and use of resources, written from the perspective of an upper-class Greek landlord aristocrat philosopher of the minus 300s. Aristotle sees the science of oikos nomos, the study of the rules of household resource management, economics, the science of acquisition. He sees that as having 4 branches. The 4th and least important of the branches to Aristotle is the knowledge of production processes, technologies, and market conditions. You need to know these things. They are, quote, "not unworthy of philosophy," unquote. Why not? Well, since you cannot make everything you need for a good life within your household, you have to trade and exchange, which means you have to decide what things your household will produce in surplus that you can then offer in exchange. Proper knowledge of technologies, production processes, and market conditions is essential, then, to keep from being cheated by your counterparties and to use your household resources well in this dimension in producing a useful surplus for you to trade away. But too great attention to this would be, Aristotle says, crude, or another translation would be in poor taste. It would tend to make you one of those people who tries to pile up wealth without limit and forgets what it is for, forgets how to live philosophically. So that's the 4th and least important branch of the science of acquisition. Another branch, a more important branch than technologies and the marketplace, is how to command your wife harmoniously. For she does not have your rational soul, and her excellence lies in obedience and in following directions. Do note that here Aristotle is arguing against his teacher Plato and against Plato's teacher Socrates, who held the opposite view, that the souls and excellences of men and women were of the same kind. A still more important branch, says Aristotle, is how to exercise your royal rule. as you raise your children properly. And the most important element of economics? It's how to boss your slaves so that they work hard and effectively to create the wealth, so that you have the freedom and leisure to pursue your appropriate role in the political society that is the Greek city-state. This is, Aristotle says, how it is and how it always will be. Good societies need slaves, and lots of them, to be bossed around by those who excel in the rational elements of the soul, in order to create a leisured class with the kind of skill, the experience, and the time to actually manage the society. And this will always be true, Aristotle writes, except in fantasies in which, quote, every instrument could accomplish its own work, obeying or anticipating the will of others, like the robot blacksmithing statues of Daedalus or the three-wheeled catering serving carts of Hephaestus, which, says the poet Homer, of their own accord entered the assembly of the gods. The shuttle would weave, and the plectrum touch the lyre without a hand to guide them. It is manifest, therefore, Aristotle writes, that of people some are slaves by nature, and for these slavery as an institution is both expedient and just. Well, we today have, although our predecessors as late as 1870 did not, we have the robot blacksmiths of the inventor Daedalus. And while I have never seen a three-wheeled robotic catering serving cart with sensors that Homer imagined the smith god Hephaestus could make, we could build them. We have the weaving machines and the music players. Nearly every song we think of is immediately accessible wherever we are. And robot factories exist that contain the looms, a human, and a dog with, as Berkeley Business School Dean Aaron Harrison says, the machines are there to weave the cloth, the dog is there to deter machine thieves, and the human is there to feed the dog. If it is the usefulness to us of our collective powers to manipulate nature and organize humans that matters more, the estimated jump from a 1,300 to an 11,000 average annual income level vastly understates by how much our wealth exceeds that of all past ages and has jumped since the late 1800s. But if it is our net ability to see them jump that matters more, the estimated jump in my table overstates by far how much our greater wealth matters. Now let me move on to a little bit of economic theory. By now I've set out some numbers, tried to count some things, guessed at some others, warned you that my counts are unreliable or perhaps of the wrong things, or maybe that there is no right thing to count here. But now let me stake out this table of numbers as a hill that I will die on and assume that it is true and draw out some more implications. And let me first do so by setting out a simple standard aggregate economic model. An aggregate production function with output per worker Y equal to capital intensity kappa, raised to a parameter theta that measures the salience of capital relative to worker efficiency in production, all multiplied by the efficiency of labor E. An equilibrium condition that on the steady-state balanced growth path an economy's capital intensity kappa will be the quotient of the economy's saving investment share of spending in total income, S, divided by the economy's investment requirements, which are the sum of the labor force growth rate N, the labor efficiency growth rate G, and the capital depreciation rate delta. Last, the efficiency of labor E is equal to the value H of the stock of useful ideas about technology, about how to manipulate nature and organize humans, times natural resources R per worker L, all this raised to 1 over delta, where delta is a parameter that governs the salience of ideas relative to resources. The salience of ideas relative to resources in generating working efficiency. This is an economic model. It is all of three things. It is a useful filing system for analyzing growth. It is a powerful intuition pump for generating ideas about where, in real empirical economies, we should direct our attention in studying growth. And it also can be a pointless and exclusionary formal ritual that makes some voices hard to hear. I want to take this model seriously and make 3 further assumptions. The first is that over the long run, variations in capital intensity are unimportant and can be neglected. The second is that over the long runs, variations in the ratio of the labor force to the population are unimportant and neglected. We used to have a large share of children in the population. Now we have a large share of old people. The third is the value of the parameter gamma is 2, that ideas are, say, twice as important as resources per worker in determining efficiency of labor. Under those assumptions, it is then the case that we can simply determine humanity's technological prowess at any moment in history, that its level of the useful ideas stock H, by simply taking our estimated or guessed level of output per capita and multiplying it by the square root of the population. So I'm then going to normalize this H by setting its value equal to 1 in 1870, and I'm going to calculate H's proportional growth rate looking back through history. And then I'm going to zoom in. I'm going to zoom in on the world as a whole for the past 500 years and the next 80. What can we say about human technology and its past and future likely pace of improvement? The first thing we note is that worldwide, the average rate H at which the deployed and diffused ideas stock H accessible to humanity has been growing. It's been 2.1% per year since 1870. And that rate, that's more than 4 times as fast as the rate of increase had been during the 1770 to 1870 century of the British Industrial Revolution, during Europe, which European colonialists had conquered, or in the case of Africa, south of Sahara, poised themselves to conquer, the world. And our 2.1% since 1870 over the past 4 generations. That's 14 times the pace of growth of the technological ideas stock during the 1500 to 1770 imperial commercial age. That saw the Spanish-Portuguese conquest of the Americas, the rise of European seaborne empires with their joint monopolies over open trade in fortified ports, the West African Caribbean slave trade, and the Columbian Exchange as the Old World got corn, the potato, chocolate, tobacco, and the rest of New World biotechnology, and the New World got the animal and small grain-based agricultural biotechnology of the Old World, plus bubonic plague, smallpox, and conquest. And our 2.1% per year, that's 22 times the pace of growth in the pre-1500 agrarian age. So what we have seen and are still seeing, and will almost surely see for most, if not all of your lifetimes, technological progress at a rate that before 1500 took a century, we see every 5 years, and we see it progressing at that much higher proportional rate from a much higher substantive base. Managing that pace of extraordinarily rapid and net productive creative destruction, in Schumpeter's terms, managing that in the interest of creating a truly human world, is something that our governments and societies are not conspicuously excellent at, or succeeding in. Most conspicuous today, and for my lifetime, and for the lifetime, at least 1 or 2 lifetimes before me, among the failures of global economic management is the extraordinary failure of the technologies that have been developed since 1770 to fully diffuse across the world. The industrial innovations, they had their initial start, in the Dover Circle. In the Dover Circle, 300 miles in radius, centered on the port of Dover in the southeastern corner of England. And technologies and institutions were then carried and diffused via the natural increase of the population there and its emigration, through conquest and settlement, through emulation by others, through osmosis, and through diffusion, and throughout. They diffused throughout the world. But they diffused only partially and incompletely, and the result is that there today is a thing called the global north, which in its imagination at least traces continuity of descent and commonality of identity in some sense with the civilization of the Dover Circle of half a millennium ago, a day half a millennium ago when the Dover Circle was nothing special, and when no prince or merchant of the Yellow, Yangtze, Mekong, Ganges, Indus, Sir Amu, Sir Daria, Tigris, Euphrates, or Nile valleys would have wanted to change place with their counterparts of the Rhine, Meuse, Seine, or Thames valleys. And the result is that today there is a thing called the Global South, which is the rest of the world, which stood on average at least on a par with the people of the Dover Circle in income and technology 500 years ago, who today have average incomes less than 20% as high. This between society inequality may or may not now be in a process of long-term erosion, but it certainly wasn't a process of tremendous expansion and explosion of divergence from 1800 to at least 1980. The current 4.5 to 1 edge of the global north relative to the world average, it is principally due to differential creation and adoption of technologies, but secondarily and substantially due to the engrossment of a greater than equal share of the world's natural resources through conquest, occupation, extortion, and bomb purchase. And Simon Kuznets, back in 1971, pointed out that this created very difficult problems for creating a truly human world, for realizing what ought to have been already the diffusion of technologies that are non-rival to enable general human wealth. He pointed to factors that in his day have limited the spread of economic growth, and the scary fact that Japan was the only nation outside of those with large chunks of their population rooted in European ancestry that had joined the group of developing countries, and that the increasingly national cast of organization in developed countries made for policies clearly inhibiting convergence. Colonial status, imperialist expansion, all of these neutralizing the remarkable institutions by which the Cynic and East Indian civilizations had previously produced huge unified societies that dwarfed in size any that originated in Europe until very recently. Nor, he warned back in 1971, is the social technology that evolved in the currently developed countries likely to provide models of institutions or arrangements suitable to the diverse institutional and population size backgrounds of many less developed countries. It will not be a matter of merely borrowing existing tools, material and social, or of directly applying past patterns of growth, merely allowing for differences in parameters. The institutional requirements are likely to be particularly great in social and political structures. A long period of experimentation and struggle lies ahead, and this process will become more intensive and acute as the perceived gap widens between what has been attained and what is attainable. Nothing in the past half-century, especially not the institutional dysfunctions we clearly see right now in much of the global north, suggests that these worries by Simon in his Nobel Prize lecture 50 years ago were overstated. Now, I do not have time. I do not have time to more than observe that any assessment of societal wealth must deal not just with averages, but within society distributions as well, and that this is particularly true in a market economy. In a non-market or in a partial market economy, there are many sources of social power, and so many ways to access resources other than through the control and expenditure of wealth. People then have rights springing from their membership in a status group, in a kin network, or in some other sociological institution. But in a market society, the only rights that are recognized, the only sources of social power, are property rights. And in a market society, the only property rights that are worth anything, those are those that aid in the production of commodities for which the rich have a substantial market demand. As Amartya Sen, who I think still has my copy of Karl Polanyi's book Trade and Market in the Early Empires that he borrowed from my office in 1990, as Amartya Sen has stressed, an unequal market society will be one in which the market, and so society, literally does not care whether those without wealth live or die. It is a matter of indifference to it, because the only thing the market can see and thus care about are effective demands, and those without wealth have no effective demand for anything. Now, I do not have time and space or space to do more than gesture at within society inequality, by gender, by ethnicity, by class, by status group, by kinship, etc. But any assessment of a society's wealth, or perhaps of a society's ability to make proper use of its potential wealth, any such assessment must assess not just averages, but the within society inequality dimension as well. I'm finding I have too much to say, and so I think I should start winding up toward a conclusion. All right, that today has seen me undertake a towering construction, but one truly based on a foundation of straw. That is why I warned you back at the beginning that I saw my role as one of provoking and starting a discussion, rather than providing solid and stable and conclusions one could call truly scientific. Nevertheless, to answer the question of how much more wealthy are we than our predecessors, the answer is 20. We humans today are 20 times as potentially wealthy as our predecessors were back in 1870. And our predecessors back in 1870 were themselves some 20 times as wealthy as our joint predecessors back in the early agrarian age 7,000 or so years ago. From the early agrarian age to 1870, however, increased human potential wealth in the sense of useful technological ideas stored up as a stock that humans could draw on, it was used overwhelmingly up until 1870 to support a larger human population and secondarily to enrich a larger, largely parasitic, if at times civilizationally glorious upper class, rather than for the betterment of the average or the typical human. Since 1870, with the coming of the demographic transition, we have done much, much better. Nearly any previous society would say that we today are certainly wealthy enough in per capita terms that it is truly surprising we have not used our collective wealth and distributed it to create a real utopia, a truly human world. Yet it is manifestly the case that we have not. However, I see very strong arguments that the factor of 20 is by far an underestimate. The factor of 20 is really an estimate of commodity value based on factor cost, an estimate based on use value on the material basis for human flourishing, as it enables humans would see our relative wealth relative to our predecessors as vastly greater. And yet, an estimate based on the usage we have made of our potential wealth, it might be significantly smaller. For one thing, of the 4 freedoms that Franklin Roosevelt thought ought to be humanity's birthright, freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear, only freedom from want can be directly and immediately secured by material prosperity. Yet a wealthy society should make the benefits of impinging on the freedoms of others vastly less, and should make the difficulty of vindicating those other freedoms vastly less as well. And you can say that and you would be right. Nevertheless, we as a species, as a community, have not vindicated and secured those other freedoms. Back before 1500, people located utopias when they thought about them, either in the heavens or in some past golden age, or at the very least elsewhere on some distant island. That the way things were in this world, the near consensus was, in this fallen sublunary sphere at least, was that of the wheel of fortune. Again, to go back to Aristotle and Aristotle's framing, a monarchy decays and turns into a tyranny, which is overthrown by an aristocracy, which turns into an oligarchy. The oligarchy is then overthrown by a democracy, which decays into an anarchy, which is then succeeded by a monarchy again, in a cyclical process with a good and a down phase in every third of the wheel of fortune's rotation. But short of God or the gods coming down to earth, bringing a new Jerusalem, or at least bringing the three-wheeled robot catering serving carts that the Smith god Hephaestus is busy making when Achilles' mother, the demigoddess Thetis, arrives to divert him from making the artifacts of peace to making the weapons of war for her son, human history and wealth back before 1500 did not have a perceived direction. Now, starting in 1600, a direction begins to appear. Tommaso Campanella, in his book The City of the Sun, writes about how there has been more historical progress in the past century he has seen than in all previous epochs. Even though he somewhat ruins the effect by then attributing this progress to the astrological influences of the planet Mercury and the constellation Scorpio. Francis Bacon writes in his The New Atlantis that human society has been transformed utterly by the triple invention of the compass, gunpowder, and printing, and he calls for large-scale government-sponsored research and development to produce more new inventions, to the enlarging of the human empire and the effecting of all things possible. I think that both of their reactions to the sight of our civilization today, our global civilization today, would be puzzlement and confusion. Why, given our technology-driven wealth, is the world today not much more of a utopia than it actually is? Why have we collectively not done better with our technological power than we have? And I have a forthcoming book about this, focusing on 1870 to 2010, called Slouching Towards Utopia, forthcoming from Basic Books on September 6th, which I'm greatly looking forward to the publication of. Thank you very much for listening to me, for inviting me. It's been an enormous pleasure. But I think I have talked for long enough, and I should let you have your turn to ask questions at least.
Thank you, sir, for the insightful lecture. We can now move on to the questions from the audience.
Yes, the board unmute and ask your question.
Okay.
Yeah, good morning, sir. I had a question regarding technological growth. So, in a lot of growth models, for example, like Robert Solo's, we see that technological growth plays a central role in rising incomes. And in growth accounting, this comes out as total factor productivity growth. But how exactly do we measure this? And what drives this technological growth? And how do you explain, and how does this explain the slowdown during the 1970s or the